A year ago today, George Floyd was pinned to the ground under the knee of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, while distraught bystanders begged him to get up because he was killing him. Floyd begged for his own life before it was snuffed out, and all of it was captured on cell phone video by a very brave young woman who was walking her cousin to the store. Those indelible images gave rise to street protests and unrest in dozens of cities with millions and millions of people in the streets. It was a cultural and political moment in which it seemed even many of the central institutions in American corporate life, from NFL brands, the NFL, had suddenly signed on, at least in word or performance, to a simple but genuinely radical demand for racial equity and truth-telling. But was it just a cynical branding exercise or a strange fad? Did the cultural moment that arose from the volcanic rage and anguish of watching George Floyd killed by the state mobilize the kinds of structural changes to those institutions of the state itself, that produced the circumstances of his death? Jemele Hill is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and host of the podcast Jemele Hill is Unbothered. And Adam Serwer is a staff writer for The Atlantic, and they both join me now. You know, Jemele, I was glad that we got a chance to talk to you tonight, because you have navigated these waters in many different ways, all going back through, trying to talk about race and sports and social justice in various platforms. And as you watched that happen last year, and you watch where we are now, I wonder where do you think we are a year later in the midst of the sort of rawness that was there, and all of these institutions rushing to say the words, and what has been delivered upon since then?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and good to see you as well, Adam. It depends on who you mean by we, because I think if we're talking about what we've seen, some of the courageousness, the boldness, the fearlessness that we've seen from a lot of athletes and coaches, clearly I think that change is not just lasting, but it has been very impactful. I mean, we go through what the NBA, what the WNBA, what they were able to accomplish. And it's so fitting that we're having this discussion on a day where the NBA and WNBA and their players' unions have come out and demanded that the Senate support the George Floyd Policing Act. That's a bold and brave and lasting step for them to make. And they've kind of been there in this conversation throughout. Now, where we are as a society, well, that's a different kind of we. Because in many ways, it feels like there has been regression. It feels like that we've taken some steps back. I think certainly you can look at the insurrection at the Capitol as evidence of that. So I think there's just been a lot of stops and starts, and some of the concerns about whether or not this was a movement or just a moment. I think we're still debating that. Yeah,
there were such, it did seem in the wake of Floyd's death and the street mobilization around it, there were really new horizons being opened up, Adam, conversations about reimagined public safety, abolition of the current version of the criminal justice system, a reckoning with America's history in a sort of really, really like true deep way. Where have those projects gone, you think, in the last year?
Well, I think, one lesson we probably should have learned from the Obama presidency is that every prominent example of racial progress contains a backlash.
Yes.
That was true after Reconstruction. It was true after the Civil Rights Movement. It was true after Obama. And I think it's, probably happening now. We had a moment of enlightenment, and history says that these moments are profound and things can really change. But then there's a backlash where people retrench, where people, the established hierarchy seeks to reassert itself. Now, that said, I think, in some ways, some of these changes that have happened in people's consciousness as a result of the aftermath of the Floyd protests, they may not be as vulnerable as people think. I mean, we've seen in some cases, people like Larry Krasner won their elections. The backlash to criminal justice reform efforts hasn't quite been as broad as maybe you might have assumed. Based on that history, I mean, you still have Republicans and Democrats on the table as far as the George Floyd and Policing Act. But another reason why this is hard to measure is that so many of these fights are really local when it comes to law enforcement. That it takes some time to really see the results of what activists on the ground are pursuing. And so, it's hard to say one way or the other. But we do know that there has been a backlash. There's always a backlash. It's just the way public opinion works. And I think it's a little too early to assess what that means for these reform efforts and for this movement.
Yeah, the point about the two things that to me that have really been enduring. One, the sort of hot breath of reaction, sort of breathing down everyone's necks, when you can feel, right? I mean, you felt it obviously then, but you can feel it now just in some parts of the discourse, particularly. But also the consciousness change, Jemele, that you're saying, like in the case of athletes. But a lot of people, like people had real moments of their consciousness being shifted, and that I think applies folks of different races and ages and from different life experiences, where something did change that has carried with them in what the work they're doing or what they're trying to achieve or how they see this country and the world.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. There was a seismic shift in just how we had conversations about race, and I think that's still the case. And even though we're seeing other very dangerous examples, with all this nonsense conversation around critical race theory, and obviously what happened to fellow journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones at the University of North Carolina, we're seeing these dangerous examples of there being an assault on truth, but we're also seeing a great amount of resistance to these things. And I think that that's the part that has been probably encouraging about the last year, is that while you certainly have people who needed to be drug into the conversation, people who left the conversation, but I still sense that very earnest sense of purpose that a lot of people have. And we've just seen it a lot in sports in particular, and in other avenues where I still think that there's a lot of people willing to fight.
Yeah, Adam, the Jemele's point about Nikole Hannah-Jones, whose faculty voted to give her tenure based on her tenure package at UNC, then that was blocked by higher-ups, apparently because of folks that didn't want her to get that. And, she has been very targeted by the right for her reporting and the work she's done. But your point about the sites of this stuff is always contested. Like, it's never, there's never some supreme victory there about what the history, say, of race in America means or the structures of racial hierarchy are.
Yeah, I mean, look, how you understand your past it shapes how you understand your present. And education has long been a battleground in this sense. I mean, you can go back to the 60s and John Hope Franklin trying to write school textbooks and there being a huge reaction specifically to his inclusion of Black history in a non-racist, non-paternalistic way. And here, it is fine to argue about history. It is fine to criticize each other's interpretations of history. I think what's dangerous about this particular example with Nikole Hannah-Jones is what you're starting to see is that the right regards what it refers to as critical race theory, but what can really be described as any in-depth examination of the role of racism in American history, from a Black perspective, as so dangerous that it needs to engage in state censorship to suppress it. And I think that's a real problem.